Hi, this is Roger, and welcome to the final part of the 2020 Project Orchids. This is part 4, which I've sort of titled the shadier, cooler types, because they all come into that category in the main, but it's not all sort of one genus like some of the other parts. So this is a mixed bunch, which may or may not exist at the end of last year. The cooler, shadier ones, to a degree, do not do well for me because of the summers. And okay, past few years we have had heat waves. That has exasperated the situation basically, because it's day after day after day of temperatures that are just too high. Over a long period of time, this is serious stress. So these plants have suffered this year and last year. However, we may not get a heat wave next year. And without that, without the prolonged day after day after day, a week of hot weather, I would imagine they'd be okay. They'd put up with it, and then it would become reasonable again. So it's debatable whether I will keep my cooler, shadier ones into next winter. I could do with the space, but then they're not going to free up that much space because there's not that many of them. And there aren't that many of them because they don't do very well. Once you twig that something doesn't do very well, it's a bit daft carrying on buying loads of them, isn't it? I've got other genera that do well in here, and they do well winter and summer. So it would pay to have the majority of my orchids in that category. So there may be some adjustments. It'll be towards the end of next year. I don't plan on buying lots more orchids. I've still got some orchids probably to come from our chairman's collection. He's just passed away, Christmas Day. It's nice for the sort of close friends and family, isn't it? But nonetheless, at the moment, we can't sort his orchids out because of the COVID restrictions. So it's just a big deal at the moment. But somebody's going to look after them in the meantime. I don't want to mention to that person how long that meantime might be, because it could be 4 to 6 months before we can get in and sort those orchids out. Luckily, it's close by. And certainly this time of year there wouldn't be much to do, but anyway, that's to be seen. In the meantime, let's get on and have a look at these cooler, shadier types and see how they've fared this year, given that we did have another prolonged heat wave again. So let's get going with the first one. So first up, Dracula Bella. Now this started the year as not a bad looking plant. It had been repotted in, it was a mixture of zombie moss and live sphagnum around the outside and over the top. And if you look, it's not a bad looking plant. There's a couple of brown tips on a couple of leaves, but generally speaking, the plant looked in pretty good health considering the environment it's living in. And we had a spike. We had an initial flower spike showing at this point, which I was well pleased about. But there again, it had done that the previous year and aborted most of the buds, so I didn't know what we were going to get this year. Would it be better? Would it be worse? Totally weather dependent, out of my control really. But it looked good at the start of the season. Moving on then, once we got to June, we're starting to get some heat around. Quite a few more flower spikes coming, almost starting to form some buds. Quite a few more leaves on the plant. You can see the plant has bushed up a bit in that time, but not all the leaves look quite so good. We're starting to get some spots, still got some brown tips, but not a lot of new ones. A few leaves had dropped, but not many, and they'd been replaced by a lot more leaves. So at this stage of the game in June, we effectively had not a bad looking plant, although some of the leaves were starting to look a bit old and tired. And we had a good smattering of spikes. I think there's 6, maybe even 7 there. So not too bad. And then once we got to this point in September, we'd had our heat wave and everything. And you can see now the plant's not looking so good. Yeah? And this is my idea with keeping these records. It's not just for doing interesting videos. So obviously this plant has deteriorated through the summer months, whereas it looked nice and green and bright at the end of the winter months. You can see what's going on here. Anyway, you can see that the spikes have pushed on. You can also see that on the end of one of those spikes, or on two of them in fact, are aborted buds. So out of all of these spikes, and some of these are new ones and old ones have gone, we've still yet to have a bloom. So many spikes, and I was starting to question what was in the pot. Okay, so Dracula Bella had the treatment. Basically, I was not happy with what it looked like, and 9 times out of 10, if your plant has still got its leaves, and it's sort of looking okay but not as good as it used to be, the place to look is not at the leaves, the place to look is below the leaves in the pot. Because 9 times out of 10 that's where your problem will be. And lo and behold, that's where the problem was. Now, I lifted the plant out of that basket it was in and the spikes came with it. But I decided to restart the plant basically, because obviously it's going to use energy to keep pushing those spikes and try and produce buds and blooms. So I took them off. It had some roots. I won't say it had a good root system, but it had some, but it wasn't very good. And it's now been potted up in the basket with the cocoa fibre, cocoa husk. Which stays moist. It does the same sort of job as moss, but it hopefully just doesn't deteriorate anywhere near as fast, and it doesn't compact. That's the beauty of this stuff, and it doesn't seem to get algae all over it either. Another bonus. So anyway, what we had was not very good roots, into a new media, spikes off. So that's what we've done with it. Now what we've got is obviously the leaves that still had some marks on them as a consequence are still marked. Those marks aren't going to go away. I've trimmed some of the brown tips off of the leaves to make it look a little bit better, and we do have some new roots growing now. Yeah, so we've got some roots. They're right at the top of the plant. They will need to burrow down in there, which will rely on me making sure this stays moist now. Yeah, so that they can grow down into the media. So I think it's going to recover okay. When it will start shooting out new spikes again, I really don't know. Quite honestly, I'd prefer it got on and grew a decent root system in its new media and settled down as soon as possible before it starts getting warm in here again. So it's got a good couple of months, maybe 3, pushing it, to get itself a root system sorted out. And then hopefully it'll be okay. It is still producing the odd new growth now and again. Yeah, so it's still sort of growing. There's a new leaf come out the back there. There's another one out the side. So it's in growth. It's starting some roots. So let's see where it goes from there. The fact that it's made it through the previous summer and taken a repot, you know, and is now really in a state of recovery, it's not looking as bad as I would have expected. But I'm hoping that this one will improve. That's my goal for this year, is to see this plant do better and hopefully produce some spikes later in the year that will then bloom. That's what I've got hoped for this one. So that's Dracula Bella. Okay, on to one of the bigger things. This is my Coelogyne cristata, and it's actually the variety lemoniana, which has got nothing to do with the colour. It's because it was first described by a Dr. Charles Lemon, I think it was, so that's where the lemon bit comes from anyway. We'd had a couple of blooms on this, but not a good blooming. Obviously the plant had been disturbed to put it in this shallow basket. It's in a mix of bark and moss, and the basket itself is lined with moss, so that's what it's living in. But disturb the roots on a cristata and you will get a stall and a setback. It's almost inevitable. But nonetheless, we came out of the winter with a couple of blooms and the plant wasn't looking too bad. Now again, we've got a plant that doesn't really like the heat too much, but it will put up with it. This coelogyne will put up with heat if you keep it wet and keep the humidity in the air high and keep the air moving so that the leaves don't get hot. So we'll put up with it. And you can see at this stage of the game in June we have a lot of new growths pushing on here. They look like spikes. They're not. They're the leaves pushing up. The bulbs will form below them later. So coming into reasonable growth. So although I was expecting a stall, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. And these new growths should produce some blooms if all goes well for the rest of the year. But not looking bad. And once we get to this stage, the new growths are forming their bulbs, and they are large and they are plump and they are looking pretty good. The trouble is with the cristata is it does tend to push away, so you get climbing rhizomes, and because they're covered in sheaths which are brown, they start to make the plant look a little bit tatty when that happens. You can see almost in the centre there a climbing rhizome. Yeah, with the tatty brown sheaths. But this is what they will clamber all over the place on top of old bulbs, pushing upwards. They form a mound eventually with all the new stuff on top. So nonetheless, maturing bulbs, hopefully some blooms to follow. Okay, the cristata, I'm pleased with what this has done. Again, it will take heat, it will tolerate heat, providing it never dries out in the heat and has good air humidity and air movement, and they will put up with it. And they are very prone to stalling and sulking after root disturbance. So I'm pleased with the growth I got this year following that, yeah, and having a heat wave. And what we've got are the largest bulbs I've ever had on the new growths. These are very large bulbs. Well pleased with the new growths this time round. Largest bulbs ever, including one that came out the side. So I'm pleased with this year's growth. And in theory, each one of those new growths should now spike. That's the theory. We shall see. It is remotely possible that the embryo spikes might even show up now, this time of year. They'll be down in under the sheaths. I can't see any on that one. I just chose that one because it's a nice big fat plump one. Yes, there it is. That's the spike coming out there. And here, yep, there's the spike. So that's two. I suspect there are more. I'm not going to go digging around for them at the moment. Yes, we have spikes. There's another one there. So that's three. That's a minimum of 3 spikes we've got there. And I think because that has now got a reasonable root system, and it's got some huge big fat bulbs with some quite large ones backing them up in places, I think there'll be enough energy in there to produce some good spikes this time, because I think last time it bloomed the spike only had 2 blooms. It should have more than that. So there we go. I'm pleased with this one. This is doing okay. It's staying in the basket. It will be encouraged to just pile up basically, and in one case hang down the side. So be it. I'm just going to leave it to do its own thing. Obviously there'll come a time when that media is going to start getting a bit iffy, because it's been in there a while. But this is being allowed to totally dry through the winter. So I do let it dry, and then I don't soak it, I moisten it. And because it's moss, you can pour a relatively small amount of water near the surface, and it will just gradually permeate throughout the whole pot, leaving it slightly moist, but not wet. Yeah? So that's what I'm doing with mine. I'm still convinced there are 2 types of Coelogyne cristatas, because a lot of the ones you see have got little round pseudo bulbs of a yellowish colour and much smaller leaves. Now that would imply they're perhaps from a higher region where they're just they haven't got the luxurious growth that you would get in lower regions. Yeah, with better temperatures, perhaps more rain, blah blah blah. So I think there may be like two forms, and if you get a form from the lower regions, it's far more heat tolerant, grows much bigger egg-shaped bulbs, and has much bigger, darker green leaves. And that's what mine looks like. Now, I can't, nobody else has taken this up. It needs them men in the white coats with the goggles on to have a look and see if there are two distinct forms, like a highland and a lowland form, or an upland and a lowland form. There are other orchids that have taken that sort of shape in their evolutionary process, where it's the same plant, DNA absolutely identical, but they grow differently depending on the elevation. So maybe this is just one of them. The fact that it's variety lemoniana is, it's not like a hybrid, it's not like somebody's produced it, it's just one of the forms that come out sort of naturally. So it was discovered and named and described by a Dr. Summit or other, well, a Mr. Lemon basically, and so it is that particular variety. The blooms are almost identical. You can't really tell much difference, but there is a slight difference if you put the two next to each other, the standard form and the lemoniana form. You will see the difference, but it's not obvious to most people. You'd have to see them next door to each other. Anyway, very pleased with the progress, and we are going to get some blooms. Don't hold your breath. They're very slow to progress. Probably February, I would say. So yeah, quite a while yet. But they are to come. So unless those spikes are bought, we will get blooms this time round. Yay, good stuff. And the Masdevallia ignea, again, this is a cool to cold grower. This doesn't like heat, doesn't like it at all. The only way it's got any chance of surviving is high air humidity and movement. Again, this was potted up in an open basket. There's a lot of live sphagnum moss went into that, and it was sort of okay. It wasn't happy because it got stressed so badly the previous summer. It's taken the whole of the winter for it to settle down again. But we did have some new growths pushing in amongst those. A few leaves browning in places. So a sort of, not a bad looking plant, but not exactly brilliant. No sign of any buds. Right, once we got into June, strangely enough, the plant wasn't looking too bad, but we did an experiment with it. We'd actually put it on a much higher shelf, and it got an awful lot more light. And because of where it was, it came in line with one of the larger circulating fans, so good airflow as well as more light. It managed to push up a bloom, top left-hand corner there, not showing very well its colour on that shot. The colour's not quite right on that shot, but nonetheless the higher light did manage to get it to bloom. But I was starting to get a bit suspicious about what was going on in the pot. I had a feeling the roots were failing because the moss was starting to get a bit niffy. So right, well, I'd had enough of what was in that pot. So I decided to take the plant out of the pot, and guess what? The roots had rotted. It was virtually rootless. That moss was just soggy, too compacted really, not enough air in round there. So while I was thinking about what I was going to do next, I decided to just plonk it in some damp moss and try and induce some root growth. There were new top growths pushing on. So in theory, if there was a reasonable media underneath that wasn't stale and compacted, those new growths should produce new roots. So that was the theory at this point, and I hadn't made my mind up exactly what I was going to do with it yet. So it was sort of on hold. Okay, we did a bull by the horns with this one. Having done some research on it, when it came to be repotted, which it desperately needed, yet again, not that good a root system. When a plant shows signs of going downhill, even though I didn't do it, I would suggest you get in that pot and have a look, because the sooner you get at it, the better. And if there's a problem in the pot, the sooner you deal with it, the sooner it should recover. So, you know, I would say this stayed in that media a bit too long and lost some roots. But having done some research, Masdevallia ignea isn't an epiphyte. It's found far more often growing as a terrestrial. Now, it doesn't grow in the dirt as such. It tends to grow in sort of leaf litter on the forest floors. But nonetheless, it would need probably a more terrestrial mix than perhaps most other Masdevallias need. So that's what we did. We repotted this. You can go and find the video if you like. If I remember, I might put a link to it. But a totally different media this time round with peat. So I added some of my chunky peat that I got from my Deesers with some charcoal and some coconut husk. I think there's a bit of sponge rock in there as well. And that's what it's in. So it's in a more terrestrial based mix. And we do have quite a few signs of new growth starting. But what we need is new growth to push out new roots, of course. But without the new growths, you're probably not going to get the new roots. Yeah, some are even pushing on. So we have new growth, hopefully to replace the leaves that have gone downhill a bit during the summer and due to the lack of roots. So hopefully this one's going to perk up a bit. I've got to go careful with the watering because of the new media type. With the peat in there, it not only holds a lot of water, but it holds it for a long time. So I obviously don't want this to become beyond that moist and become soggy. Yeah, so I've got to go careful with the watering. So I let it get not dry, but heading towards dryness, and then it gets some water. It doesn't get the sort of soaking I give my plants, you know, that have got like a wet dry cycle, or, you know, in the summer when the heat's in here. So I'm treating it carefully with kid gloves, and hopefully it's going to pull on. When it's got some roots and I can see them down in the pot, then it's going to get the light to induce some blooms. But I want the plant to settle into its pot before I add another level of change to it by increasing the light level. So I'm keeping it in with the other Masdevallias at the moment, but this one can be found growing out in the open, and it blooms well under those conditions. So, you know, when all the books say heavy shade, they're not always right. Sometimes you have to get out more and go and see the real thing and not copy what somebody else said once upon a time. Anyway, it's sort of recovering. That's all I can say at this point. Whether it's going to recover and become a nice looking plant again, I don't know. Only time will tell. But the fact that the new growth is there now, it's got all of the rest of the winter and early spring to get those roots going. So that's, you know, that should be good. We'll see how it goes. Now this is one of the Miltoniopsis I got at our 60th anniversary show, which would have been in effect a year prior to this. So I repotted these plants when I got them. There was a set of 3, and they were all very, very poor in the pot. The media was awful, and the roots were rotten. So I ended up with plants. The plants looked good, otherwise I wouldn't have bought them. But what was underneath the, you know, the top, the base of the plant was very, very poor. So these got repotted. They then had to put up with the summer months with all the heat, which luckily they didn't go downhill. They just hung in there, but they didn't move much. They didn't grow and they didn't do roots. They survived. As you can see in the summer, just about hanging in there, a few more spotty leaves and some root growth against those new growths. But I was starting to get a bit worried because the media had quite a lot of moss on it because of it, you know, being a Miltoniopsis and needing to stay damp all the time when they're in growth. I was starting to get a bit iffy about the media. I wasn't sure whether it was still okay. I mean, at this point, it's only about 15, 16 months old, you know, so it's not ancient, but with moss it can go off. And we had some new roots, and those were going to be the telltale signs, because if the media wasn't very good, those roots wouldn't want to go down into it. So let's see. And now you can see what I'm getting at. Those roots did not make it. you know, they started to brown. They failed, really. They didn't work very well. And you can see now the plant is deteriorating. It's okay. This is the end of the summer. This is its worst time to, you know, to be a good looking plant. But the leaves have lost a bit of colour. It's not looking as good as it was at the start of the summer. Almost to be expected with these plants. They do like to stay cool and airy, these like to be, and that's not what it's like in my grow space in the summer months. So this needed something doing with it to revitalise it. And this is what happens if you leave a plant in a dark corner. You look round and there's 3. So what we did with this one, basically, I declared the media that they were in as tired and old, and you must not let your media start to go off with Miltoniopsis. The roots are just very sensitive. So unpotted, and it naturally went into pieces. I think the expression is fell apart. But nonetheless, it was decided, the reason I got the coconut husk was for these and for my zygo. That was the reason for getting it. Just specifically for those types of plants. It'll get used for other types of plants. Now I've got it, but that was its primary purpose. Now this one split up into a plant with 2 pseudobulbs, mature, leaved, and a new growth. Now we haven't got new roots on that new growth yet, but don't forget this hasn't been done long. The existing roots were poor, very poor. And then we had this piece, which was an old pseudobulb and a new growth, strong new growth. Yeah, no sign of new roots yet, but that's piece number 2. And then piece number 3 was what was left. It's what these 2 pieces with their growths came off of, leaving mature leaved pseudobulbs with no new growths. Now, under normal circumstances, I'd have just binned that, but because yellow Miltoniopsis are not common, not easy to find, and certainly here in the EU are very thin on the ground. And I thought this is a nice yellow one, very large, very nice colour. So I thought having multiple plants of this might be a better idea than chucking it in the bin. So it's gone in a pot, hardly any roots and no new growths. And it's just sitting there, which is what I expected it to do. It may be able to push a new growth out at some point, but it's got a twig that its growing points have been lost before anything's going to happen. Yeah, because it in its sort of makeup, it's an old part of the plant, so it's not supposed to be growing. These were the bits that had the growing points, and they've been taken off. So eventually this should respond. And we'll see how we go. But what we've got now is 3 where there was once 1. And I'm quite happy to keep this media quite wet because it's got so much air in round it. And it's fresh. So these do stay quite wet. And because they're cooler growers, they're not going to slow up. Because it's winter, they might slow up a bit because of the shorter day lengths. They've still got to put up with that. But they're in their element now. They've got the cooler temperatures, they've got some airflow, they've got some fresh new media. I'm hoping they're going to pull on nicely and hopefully get some blooms on these 2 latest growths would be good. They look strong enough and healthy enough for me, but we need some roots. We need some replacement roots down in some fresh media to make these plants sort of strong again. So it's a wait and see, but I'm hopeful that these 2 pieces are going to do fine. What that's going to do, I haven't got a clue. It may just sit there and end up shriveling and dying. And it may produce a new growth and some roots, in which case it'll make it. If it does produce a new growth and some roots, the growth would have a lot of backup because it's got 3 good plump pseudobulbs there, all of which have leaves. So it would have backup, you know. Anyway, that's what happened to that one. Where there was 1, there is now 3. Right, another Miltoniopsis. And this is Miltoniopsis phalaenopsis, one of the few Miltoniopsis true species still found in the wild, this one. This was a gift from Zena before she trolled off to Italy, and I was pleased to get a species, but on investigation this one grows a bit higher up than, a bit lower down than some of the others, so it's a little bit more heat tolerant. So I was hoping this one would be better in my summer than some of the others. So, you know, that's a matter of time will tell and all that. But it had a few new growths, it had been repotted, so it was in reasonable media, and it was a matter of seeing if it could survive the summer and progress the new growths. Well, the new growth started to push on quite nicely, so not looking bad. And although you can't see them at the moment, but I was getting some root growth. It was starting to generate a few more roots because it didn't have very many when it was repotted. So it's sort of coming on. Some of the older leaves on the oldest part of the plant were starting to yellow. Difficult to say whether that was natural behaviour or not, because I hadn't had the plant anywhere near long enough to tell. So I just have to accept it, basically. And I was pleased it was still alive. I was pleased it was growing some roots. So it looked like this was going to make it, and maybe one day we'll get some blooms on it. But we need some growths to mature first. So, end of the summer, not looking so good. Not looking so good. A few brown leaves, some leaves lost, one new growth rotted. Yeah? So you have to stop and say, what made this go downhill? And I would suggest stress. Yeah? Not having a good enough root system, trying to produce one in the heat that it didn't like, because although these are a little more heat tolerant, they don't like heading up to 30 degrees, which is what I'd had quite a long prolonged period of. So I think this was stress related, but difficult to tell when you haven't had a plant through several seasons to see what's going on. But this looked like it was going downhill. Let's see what it's like now. Okay, the little species Miltoniopsis, that actually got repotted into the cocoa husk. That had grown some roots, so this wasn't a poor root system. It wasn't brilliant, but there was enough there for hopefully the plant not to feel disturbed that much, changing the media. So it's gone in the coconut husk. We've started a new growth down there near the bottom since it was repotted. That's good. And the previous new growths are maturing, except for that little one in the middle there, which has lost a leaf and doesn't seem to be swelling up that much. But we shall see. We shall see. I mean, this is early days for this plant. I haven't had it long. But with any luck, the fact that it's more heat tolerant, it'll carry on, you know, growing some roots and some new growths and pushing on despite the summer months. So yeah, that's a little one. That's a pretty little one. And if we ever get it to bloom, the blooms are very attractive. They're a pure white with a nice deep red patterning. And we're used to the Miltoniopsis hybrids, and some of those have the splash or waterfall pattern. Some have some blotchy markings, but the markings on this one, I would say, are almost unique and don't seem to be repeated in the hybrids. So it would be nice to see some Miltoniopsis species blooms in here on this tiny little plant. It is a miniature, it doesn't grow big. And we have a new growth to sort of start the ball rolling. Who knows, we might get a spike on one of the other growths that it's matured. But again, it's a wait and see. It's a new plant, haven't had it long. So we'll see how that progresses. But I'm happy that it's okay and it's pushed up a new growth since it's been repotted. And hopefully it'll settle into that media nicely. So that's that one. And last but not least is this little Paphiopedilum delenatii, and this is the variety vinicolor.
I would keep this plant if it was healthy, which it isn't, because of the leaves. They're a beautiful pattern, absolutely beautiful. But this came down from Hannah when she went in hospital with no roots. And I'd already had it at the beginning of this season, 2 years, and it still hadn't grown roots. But it had grown a new leaf. So at the start of the season we had 3 older leaves and a new one pushing on. That's the one sort of pointing more upright. And there was a root. There was this root, just the one. Okay, so pushing on into June, all that's really happened with this is it's been repotted, yeah, because the media was getting a bit old, and it had gone into my latest sort of idea, no moss, bark, charcoal, and in this case some sponge rock, as a new idea to replace the moss so that the media doesn't go off so quick. That means the roots don't get disturbed. They can just sit there and grow and not keep getting poked about, pulled and pushed around because the moss keeps going off. So that's the theory. Now all that's happened with this, apart from the repot really, is that new leaf has grown a bit. Talk about slow. That's all it's done in 3 months, is that leaf has grown a bit. Right, now this is a yes and no, not looking so good now because it's lost a leaf for a start, so it looks smaller. And at this particular point in time, I've deliberately angled that. In the centre of the plant, it looked like it was trying to grow a new leaf and it had rotted. That's what it looked like. It was difficult to say. And I remember somebody said, you know, that could be a bud, because that would look different to a leaf, but difficult to tell when it's right down in the crevice between the 2 top leaves. So I didn't know whether I had a rotting new leaf or a bud, and whether the whole crown was going to fail or not. So it was a trifle worrying, to say the least.
Okay, so this is the final plant in the final part of the final updates. It's got an air of finale. I don't know what the word is. It's final anyway. And whereas last time we looked at this, we thought we had a rotting crown. Some said it could be a bud. It turned out it was a new leaf in the end. These leaves have a very, very deep purple burgundy type colour border around them. And the younger the leaf, the more pronounced the border looks. So what we were looking at was that dark colour, and we couldn't see the green patterning yet because the leaf hadn't opened enough. So I thought I'd lost the crown of that, in which case that would have been the end of the plant, obviously. But it's not a happy bunny, but it's growing a new leaf again. It keeps doing this. And we've got one single root in there without a growing tip. It needs new root. Needs more roots to be able to be what I would call successful. It's painfully slow to grow. So that's in a bright light there, so you can't see the patterns. It's just painfully slow. And I've only got 3 Paphiopedilums, 2 of which came down from Hannah, which I feel I ought to keep them, as I was handed them to look after while Hannah went into hospital. And certainly at the time we weren't expecting her to come out, so it was a painful time for me. But these 2 plants were hers. She tried to grow them in her flat and failed, and I've now picked them up, and they're both still alive after some considerable time with no roots. So I don't know whether that's a success story or not. Anyway, the crown is not lost. We have another new leaf growing. But it needs the backup of some roots, which it hasn't got at the moment. So anyway, the final plant in the final part of the final updates. There we go. Okay, so that's the end of the series for 2020. It seems popular enough that I'm prepared to do it again. These videos are more complicated than my normal stuff to put together because of all the elements. All have to be sized and shaped and, all that sort of stuff. They are fiddly to do, but it keeps my hand in with the software so that if ever I really need to do something a bit elaborate like that, at least I don't have to struggle with it. So you know, I'm quite happy to do it. But next year we will be choosing a whole new set, and this set, the Cooler Shadier type, won't be there. That's going to be replaced by other. There's, you know, because it was a little restrictive. I've got quite a few orchids that I might just have one of in that genus, and it's not a Cooler Shadier one, so I've sort of excluded it by the way I've done the sets. So I think we'll carry on with the Oncidium types, the Cattleya types, and the Dendrobiums as 3 of the sets, and then we'll have the 4th set will be other, where I can put a variety of stuff in there, and it's not dependent on being Cooler Shady, if you see what I mean, to fit into the category. So that will be for next year. We will have a chat and a list of comments when we get round to it as to what orchids might be suitable for next year to follow for a year again, and we'll get them initially filmed in March, and then we'll do update 1 in June again, update 2 in September again, and then the sort of final update at the end of the year. So we'll follow them through the year, same as we did this year, but a completely different set of orchids. There is no reason why an orchid can't be included for a second year. It doesn't have to be all different ones, but we'll see how we go. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this lot. I can put this whole set of clips and stills and goodness knows what out onto my external hard drive now, and I've taken up a lot of space. But I had to keep it all until I'd finished, if you see what I mean, which I now have. So hope you've enjoyed it, and yeah, we can look forward to choosing a new set sometime next year, early next year. See you again. Bye for now.